Hello and welcome to the VO2 Lounge. This is episode 55 on Zone 2 training and if it's overrated. Zone 2 is somewhat of a cult following, I would say now. Pre-2020, people were all about the HIIT train. Now they're on that Zone 2 grind. Whether that's because of Huberman Lab or the Tier Drive, the general longevity crowd in general, or Iñigo San Millán, for example, who's been on some of these podcasts, been on GCN, been on various different places, and I think he even has his own outlet. I don't know. But in this episode, I'm going to go through a couple of the GCN videos, one of which is in reality the reason which I'm doing this episode, which has in the title, Zone 2 is Overrated. On one side of this episode, you have Olav Aleksander Bu, who is the coach of Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden, two notable triathletes. Christian Blumenfeld won Olympic gold in the triathlon, and Gustav Iden has won the Ironman World Championship. For cyclists, Iñigo San Millán probably needs no introduction. He is the head of performance at UAE Team Emirates and the coach of two-time Tour de France winner Tadej Pogačar. However, I think that has changed, and I think someone else within the team, from bits I've heard, is actually coaching Tadej now. But at the time of the episodes that I'll make reference to, he was the coach of Tadej Pogačar. The main sources of this episode are two GCN videos, as I've already said. One titled Zone 2 is Overrated, says Norwegian Supercoach, and the other Zone 2 and Beyond, Training Secrets from Dr. Iñigo San Millán, in brackets, Tadej Pogačar's coach, which can be found in the show notes, links to both videos. They're both worth a watch. There are some other Iñigo San Millán videos that I've also referenced to in this episode from GCN, because I think, to be honest, I think he's got like 3 or 4 or even 5 episodes with them. And you kind of have to flip between all of them to get kind of the general, well, I wouldn't say to get the general gist, but you do kind of have to go through all of them. He has some podcasts on the Drive podcast, which is where I first became aware of him. I think some of those are like dated 2019. They're before Tadej's first. One is dated before Tadej's first Tour de France win, and the other is post. So they reflect on the fact in the second one that, you know, he mentioned he had this new guy coming through. Don't think he mentioned who it was. And then obviously Tadej goes and wins. So they're like, oh yeah, look, this guy who we were like, yeah, he could be something special, is actually something pretty special. But with all that said, let's actually get into the episode, which is going to be a little bit more me having a little ramble in comparison to other episodes where I've got a specific study I'm going over or a review paper or so on and so forth. So be prepared for that. But before we do get into this episode, as an athlete, it can be hard to remove the emotion surrounding training and truly be objective. Maybe after a bad training session or race, you feel as though you need to go harder, dig yourself into the ground. When do you start structured training for the year? When do you peak for the year, and how many goal events can you peak for a year? How do you taper for an event without worrying about losing too much fitness? These are all questions that an athlete can have, and that's where a coach comes in. At the VO2 Lounge Coaching, we believe that training doesn't need to be overly complicated. What is complicated is ensuring that an athlete reaches the start line in the best physical and psychological condition that they can. The overwhelming nature of making decisions around your training and everything else that comes with performing at your best is why coaching exists. Leave the stress of planning training, periodization, tapering, on-the-bike fueling, and even pacing strategies or race tactics to us, and join the VO2 Lounge today by emailing the vo2lounge@gmail.com or links down below where you can register your interest. Now for the episode. So let's start with the video that caught my eye, the video that I think as of the point I'm recording this is only a few days old, maybe a week, titled Zone 2 is Overrated, says Norwegian Supercoach. Olav Aleksander Bu, who I've already mentioned earlier in the introduction, is a coach of Gustav Iden and Christian Blumenfeld, who are, of course, two very notable triathletes. These are no slouches by any means. I don't blame GCN for the title. The title is obviously provocative to gain people's interests and so on, like the whole kind of clickbaity-esque title. Obviously, it's not dishonest. He's kind of saying in it that it is overrated, but it's not as blatant as Zone 2 is a waste of time. It's not. That's not what he's saying in this. And in the episode, they are kind of, treading the line of trying to almost pit Olav head to head with Iñigo, without actually having them both there, or because there's no actual. It's not like there's a beef here or something. It's not like you're interviewing two rappers separately. You've got some kind of thing going on here. The end result actually ends up being really good, in my opinion. There's some really high quality responses from Olav, who highlights the nuance of training, and when in so many other training environments online, I mean like podcasts, where an interviewer asks this very absolute question, say for example, is Zone 2 bad? Or how many days a week should I be doing high intensity? And the interviewee comes back with an equally as absolute result or answer in saying no more than 2, no less than 2 days of high intensity a week, or Zone 2 is the be all or end all, or Zone 2 is a waste of that. It usually is pretty clear cut. But from both Iñigo San Millán and Olav, these two interviews are, I think, very high quality, and there's a lot to be learnt. I would say Olav's interview is definitely for someone who is already confused about training. He can almost help reduce that confusion. Especially if you are new to any kind of structured training. We'll get onto it in a minute, but it really outlines key things you need to have in your mind. Iñigo San Millán, the content that comes out there is incredibly scientific, and it is hard to follow if you have not been in the sphere for a little bit of time and familiar with the terminology. And when the real gems come through, it can be sometimes hard to realize they're happening because you're so dazed by all the other bits of information. But anyway, let's stick to this initial interview to begin with. As I said, does Olav think Zone 2 is a waste of time? No, of course not. Because, it doesn't. But he does start with a very good point, and kind of where I've found myself in recent times stood with Zone 2. And I'm going to stick to calling it Zone 2 and not endurance for a reason, which I'll get to in a minute. But Zone 2 is shrouded in this idea of improved mitochondrial efficiency and substrate utilization, etc., which is hard to measure for 99% of endurance athletes. We are not capable of seeing what's going on in the cell, so when we do these Zone 2 rides, really witnessing the performance improvements is kind of hard. Yeah, you can say fatigue resistance at your race, but it's far less obvious than my threshold is now 350 watts or something. This is, of course, if you're just doing Zone 2 training. And that maybe Zone 2 has become so popular as it's throttled the typical curve that people follow of getting into endurance sport, thrashing themselves every day, doing loads of HIIT work, high intensity interval training on like the assault bike, the treadmill, outdoors, indoor trainer, like trainer road, smashing it, 40-20s out there, coming out of their ears, loads of sweet spot, like every day's an intensity ride, and then getting burnt out, giving up and quitting. And then they don't touch their running shoes, their bike, whatever it is, they don't touch it ever again. And that is a very valid point, and why, to some extent, maybe that's why it's taken off so well, because it's flattened that curve of, sure, zone 2 in what now I'll get onto. To me, when someone says they're doing zone 2, specifically when they say they're doing a zone 2 ride, it doesn't happen every time, I'll give you that. But usually when someone says they're doing endurance, you kind of know that they're just going out and tapping out the day. They're going out for 4 or 5 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is, and just tapping out. They haven't really got watts in mind. They're like, yeah, heart rate's going to be low, watts are going to be low, and the average watts in general are going to be what they're going to be. I'm just going out for 4 hours because that's enough stimulus as it is. Whereas when someone says they're going out on zone 2, typically those people, when I'm talking to them, are going out for a shorter duration, maybe 2, when they could do 3 or 4. And then they're at that mathematical point of zone 2 of the whole 75% of FTP, which can be a pretty big and hard number to adhere to, which that in itself could lead to burnout. But this is a much more gradual process. And that's why I just wanted to get across. The whole difference between zone 2 and endurance in my mind is that zone 2, very mathematical, very methodical, very stringent to the power numbers. It becomes quite a hard ride, whereas endurance is just, I'm going out for 4 hours. Yeah, I'm not going to freewheel everywhere. Yeah, I'm not going to, if I have an FTP of 300, I'm not going to average 100 watts. But I'm also not going to average 230 watts or something like that, or 220. I'm probably going to average 180 to 200. And if it's 178, it's doesn't really matter. But anyway, if I'm honest, I really do like Olav's delivery and thought process around training in general. Yes, he's interested in the the minutiae of training and the detail of metabolically what's going on and physiologically what's occurring here. But what he really cares about is getting athletes faster. And at least that is what comes across in the interviews he's in, which is what we should be all interested in if we are performance orientated. If you ride sportives, ride crits, race crits, race road, whatever it is you're doing, if there is an element of you that is I'm aiming for a position, a percentage of the field, a time, and you're not just there going, I want to ride 100k once, and then that's me done, is in I've got one event, I'm going to do 100k, and that's me done. I'm now just riding purely for health, not performance. Then this methodology is really what you're looking at. You are interested in performance, not longevity and health. The general theory is zone 2 will only lead to a plateau if that is all you're doing. And he makes emphasis of the fact that he doesn't deem there to be any evidence that suggests that you could eliminate every other training zone and just do zone 2 and win the Tour de France, for example, which I think is a statement where you can understand and believe to be the case. Athlete doing 20 hours of zone 2 versus athlete doing a mixture of intervals and zone 2. Probably the one that, or almost definitely, unless there's some massive genetic difference, then the athlete doing the mixture will perform better. And same athlete, more importantly, doing 20 hours zone 2 only versus 20 hours zone 2 and other stuff, going to perform better. The distribution of which is determined by figuring out how we achieve the most work, aka kilojoules, in a given week, a given month, given year, a given decade, which I think whenever I am listening to episodes like this, when I first listened to episodes like this and podcasts like this, my goal was obtaining knowledge in the form of like understanding like the stuff I mentioned earlier, mitochondrial efficiency, substrate utilization, all these different words and what they all mean and how they relate to training and how can I implement these lab results into my training to make me a better athlete and so on and so forth. And I went through this life cycle of come into the sport, have no idea what to do, doing like training, discover intervals, start doing some intervals, discover Trainer Road podcast, then utilize Trainer Road, get a power meter, get a set of rollers, doing indoor training, burn out, stop training, start Trainer Road again, burn out, stop training, discover 80-20 and polarization, and then I don't burn out, but it's like ever more confusing. I then discover like these Iñigo San Millán pods with Pieter on the Drive podcast, and I'm like really lost now, because now I'm like, man, zone 2 is so important. How do I have to stay in zone 2. If I come out of zone 2 for a moment, then I'm like, now it's going to take 10 minutes before I get back into zone 2, and how do I determine my training periodization and all this? Whereas now, where I am definitely is more on the aspect of little gems like this, where the easiest way to know how to train based on how many hours you have a week to train, because really most of us, we're not worried about am I training enough, in the sense of you've got unlimited time to train. So you could train anywhere between 20 and 40 hours a week. So now you're actually trying to figure out how many hours in the first place should you do. Most of us, it's how many hours can we do, and then determined by that determines how we set out our week. And so whether you're doing 5 hours a week, 3 hours a week, 10 hours or 15 hours a week, you are trying to essentially do the most work possible. And so the only way to achieve that now, because you're limited by duration, which is the biggest determinant of how much work you're going to do. I mean, it doesn't matter how many intervals you do. If you've only got 3 hours, you are not going to do as many kilojoules of work as someone who's doing 15 hours a week. It's just not, unless you can hold 1,000 watts for an hour 3 times a week. Then the person doing 15 hours a week is just going to do more work. But what you have to do is, if you're only doing 3 hours a week, well, of course you're not going to have an 80-20 split of period, like you're not going to be polarized, because the method of achieving the most work is probably going to be one zone 2 ride, which is probably going to be on the weekend, so that it has the greatest potential to be as long as possible. And then your 2 other, say, 1 hour sessions in the week are some form of interval, and you initially, the further away from your event, say you're a crit rider, the way of achieving the most work is probably something like threshold or sweet spot. So having that philosophy in your head when you're far out from an event, and then as you get closer, yes, it does need to change a bit. For example, a crit, you probably want to start doing some repeatability work. I think it's a really good little gem of not information, just thought process. And so generally, the fewer hours, the more intensity you're going to do as a percentage of your total work distribution. He also touches on intervals in reserve, which is, something that is so hard, I think, for people to, and for myself, not to get right, but to actually be willing to do. And the way I've looked at it in the past is a bit like if you've ever got to the end of a race, more often than not, for me at least, it's a crit because of the duration. And you cross the line, and literally as soon at the point of crossing the line, you felt like you were giving it everything. Maybe for the last 2 laps, last 3 laps, the final sprint, whatever it is. And you get across the line and you're like, well, like 5 seconds later, 10 seconds later, you're like, I could have gone harder. That, to me, is almost the epitome of reps in reserve, in the sense that, yes, maybe you've got 5 4-minute efforts, but at the end of the 5th, or you're given 6, say, for example, you're given the opportunity to do 6, but really it's a 5 effort set. And you get to the end of the 5th and you're like, I can't do another one. Like, you finish it and that was really hard. But then you've got 5 minutes rest between the 6th one. In that moment there, you go, oh yeah, I could do another. But if you were to do another, it's going to be even more grueling. Maybe before the last minute was grueling. Now it's going to be the last 2 minutes. And I think that's really what the reps in reserve are. People who do weightlifting, as Olav said, really know this a bit better, in the sense that you know that feeling of moving the weight for the final time, knowing you could go down and get another one, or maybe another 2, but those are going to be you're going to be digging deep. And this is where I think the work concept comes into play, because say you've got a 50-week period, let's just say 50 weeks, and in that 50 weeks you want to do as much work as possible. If you in week 2 are doing 2 blocks of 12 40-20s, 12, which I don't even know if it's possible to do 3 blocks of 12 40-20s in the same workout at the intensity that 40-20 should be done at. First of all, where do you go from there? And second of all, that is going to feel like you've just finished Paris-Roubaix. Like, you're going to feel absolutely wasted. So the reps in reserve, I think the 2 gems here from this episode is to, 1, you don't need to absolutely smash yourself. And 2, think about your training as how many kgs can you get done in the course of a very long time frame. Now, essentially, Olav, understandably so, is the quintessential representation of the Norwegian method, I would say. Now, a lot of people look at the Norwegian method as like, yeah, lactate testing, VO2 max testing, and a shit ton of threshold. But really, the Norwegian method, if you remove the sampling of the individual, the measurements done to the individual, what have you got left? Well, it's how many hours can we do? How can we maximize the total work, which results in a lot of zone 4, essentially a lot of and you'll see why I used zone 4, because I'm referencing the later bit on Iñigo San Millán, but a lot of this threshold work, and that's where these double days come from, and so on and so forth. You're trying to figure out, how do we maximize the amount of work an athlete's doing? In their instance, it's what I was saying before, where they've got a limited, essentially, time to train, but maybe if they do 30 hours a week, they achieve, I don't think this correlates, but let's just use this number. They do 30 hours a week and they do 20,000 kilojoules in the week. Say then they do 22 hours or 25 hours, but there is a greater proportion of that time that is spent doing these threshold efforts, and then they achieve 23,000 kgs. They there have achieved greater total work done for a reduced number of hours. And still, though, we must consider that it's also how consistent can you be. Consistency is key in this Norwegian method of training. They also are really focused on how can we measure performance and measure What metrics can we use to aid us in training? And that I know I was saying strip away the measurements, but that's where these lactate meters come in. That's where power meters come in. That's where VO2 max comes in, because they are now methods of, they're almost biomarkers in a way to some extent of the training and the adaptions, and whether methods of going, okay, yes, VO2 max has gone up, but look, speed and performance over this course has gone down. Why is that? Let's look at this, let's look at that. And that's what they're there. They're there to inform, not to say, your VO2 max is higher, performance will be better. You need to also measure performance. They never go all out. Maybe you finish that interval and initially, as I said, you're like, that was hard. But then a minute later, you're like, I can do another. No, stop it there. Finish the session. Maybe even cut sessions short. If you get that feeling on interval 4, when you're meant to do 5, cut it short, because in the long run, you'll do better. You won't burn out. And then, how do we get faster? Without anecdotes, without any nonsense, without worrying about what your watts per kilo are, for example. Yes, watts per kilo are very useful for GC members and people climbing, because it's like, look, if we can improve your watts per kilo, in theory, you're going to get faster. But if X rider has now got an FTP of 5.5 watts per kilo, goes up a hill in 20 minutes, if they then have an FTP of which is 5.2 watts per kilo, and they go up in 19 minutes, well, it doesn't matter that their watts per kilo has changed. Their performance has improved. So that's what we really need to be focused on. And that's the summary of that initial episode, and really what the Norwegian training. I know we've done one already a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, on the Norwegian method, but I thought this episode, I almost now have like bookmarked as like, someone's new, have a look at this, and you say you're 2 months down the line and you've ingested all these bits of information. You're like, threshold, zone 2, LT1, LT2, or pyramidal, polarized, block periodization. Oh, what do I do? You see this? This will set you straight. Go watch it. It will set you straight. So that ramble went on a little longer than I expected. But anyway, on to the next episode, which was Zone 2 and Beyond, Training Secrets from Dr. Iñigo San Millán, in brackets, Tadej Pogačar's coach. Iñigo San Millán is the head of performance at UAE Team Emirates and the coach of two-time Tour de France winner Tadej Pogačar, as I mentioned earlier. The Mr. Zone 2, or at least, well, I'll get into it in a minute, but because of, let's say, the narrative of everything, Iñigo San Millán is on an episode of GCN, The Drive, all these other podcasts, and the podcast, without a doubt, will either be like, it will have Zone 2 in the title, and making reference to him, and but you watch the video, and it's not that Zone 2 is the only interval that exists. But Iñigo has a 6-zone model based on, in his words, bioenergetics. Now, because this is apparently background and, So bioenergetics is the part of biochemistry concerned with the energy involved in making and breaking of chemical bonds in the molecules found in biological organisms in general. Bioenergetic processes include gluconeogenesis and the citric acid cycle. It's a key part, obviously, and that's what he's saying is deriving his zone model. So zone 1 is essentially your recovery day. He raises the interesting point that people often overlook, and that is that we still use glucose at these very low intensities, even though fat is the main source of energy, or at least should be. And to some extent, or not even to some extent, for the most part, the more trained you are from an endurance standpoint, the less glucose you'll probably be using in this zone than someone who's very poorly trained. Even in their really low zones, they're going to probably be using more glucose, and also the wattage at which you're working at is going to be higher the more trained you are. But anyway, so zone 2, mitochondria primarily using fat for oxidation as a primary fuel source, and it's where in here somewhere in this band is where you're going to hit that fat max, the maximal utilization of fat, and then as you cross through it, you can still be in zone 2. But at the top end of zone 2, this is where you're going to start to see this first sort of inflection point of lactate, and that's where it kind of coincides with LT1 to some extent. And this is why I was saying in the previous video, great to send to someone who's real confused about what's going on. This video, you send this video to someone and they're going to come out the other end and they're going to have a bloody PhD in bioenergetics. But man, they're going to be even more confused because they're going to be so far out to sea. The water is going to be so deep that they're not going to know whether to float, swim, sink, get eaten by a shark, or just raise the white flag. They don't know what's going on. But anyway, zone 3, fat oxidation starts dropping because fatty acids are they're not fast enough essentially to synthesize ATP at the rate at which the muscle needs it. Glucose can produce ATP faster, but you get less from it. So you have a mixture of glucose and fat oxidation occurring at this point. And fast twitch muscle fibers are being recruited at this point. And at previous zone 2, he states that this is where you are maximizing the output of that slow twitch muscle fiber, the type 1 fiber, rather than these fast twitch type 2 fibers. Zone 4, which is lactate threshold or FTP, etc. Fat oxidation is minimized or is reduced. Energy system is also almost like it's primarily glycolytic. At this point, glucose enters the cell at high speed and is converted into pyruvate to be undertaken by mitochondria. The mitochondria cannot take up all the pyruvate, and therefore the excess is then converted to lactate. This is when you see the increase in levels in the blood again, so kind of LT2 area. This is that 4 millimole area, where zone 2 was that 2 millimole area. Again, this is a whole level of minutia that starts to get confusing and starts to be conflicting if you're trying to measure it yourself. The lactate that is produced by the fast twitch muscles now travels to the slow twitch muscles, and the mitochondria in the slow twitch muscles use the lactate as a fuel source. Anyone who's listened to enough of Iñigo San Millán or is up to date with how exercise science is at the moment, lactate is no longer seen as a waste product. Lactate is actually a preferred fuel over glucose due to the multiple steps required to break down glucose, and lactate is there as essentially what can happen here is this is where the lactate measuring can have a little bit of a fall over point. There's the thought that obviously some individuals seem to produce less lactate, but the lactate you're saying they're producing is only the lactate you can measure in the blood, so the stuff that's escaped the muscle. So an individual with a greater capacity to reutilize this lactate within the muscle, / their ability to clear lactate, means they could be at a higher percentage of VO2 max for the same blood lactate level, which could mean you're still overtraining the individual, and it's where it gets a bit murky. But anyway, which is kind of where that Norwegian method comes in, because they're not really, at least I don't think from what I've read, they're suggesting you spend a lot of time at this 4 millimole mark. So although they're using lactate, I suppose they're using it at a lower range, but I think there's still a heavy amount of subjective nature to the athlete feeding back how they're feeling. So I don't know. But anyway, he's not using it here as a training determinant. It's just the first half of this episode is very much, it's like receiving a lecture on substrate metabolism and bioenergetics and so on. It is real deep in the minutiae. It's a highly condensed version, I would say, of what you would see if you were to listen to him on the Drive podcast, where obviously Peter is asking him questions that are teeing him up to further dive into the depths of all of this. And I've been on like 3-hour rides where I've had one of those podcasts in my ear, and I do it with everything, music included, where I like tap out for a minute, like maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, don't know what's going on, and I re-emerge and I'm like, whoa, where am I? What's going on? Music, it's like I'm on a new song. Podcasts, less in-depth stuff that would like be equivalent to GCN content. I'm like, yeah, I can pick up what's going on here. Peer-to-peer Drive, I got to rewind that 35 minutes if I missed 20 to almost saturate myself with information so that I'm prepared to undertake what is about to come up. But anyway, this is, I would say, like a shortened version of that. It's not necessarily, you don't need to listen. I suppose the zones are interesting, but you don't necessarily need to listen to this first bit to adequately self-coach yourself. So then zone 5 is classed as a VO2 max, high intensity, 2 to 4 minute efforts. Glucose starts to become limited and converting to energy. So then you start recruiting ATP that is stored in your muscles. This is done without oxygen, hence the anaerobic nature during these shorter but still high intensity, but still aerobic for the most part. There's a great aerobic contribution. This is why track riders doing a kilo don't ride 4 hours a week of just pure high intensity. They still have to have a foundation of a huge aerobic system to even facilitate the kilo distance. So zone 6 then, sprinting, only available fuel at muscle stores ATP, can last for less than a minute. And then you're talking like Usain Bolt, for example. That, like, you know, there is no way the aerobic system can sort of support such a rate of substrate utilization, of oxidate, just of ATP production. There will be, I've never really looked into it, into the training schedules of elite sprinters and how much training volume they do that's just low intensity, like running. I'd assume there is some, because I would assume, if for nothing else, it would facilitate them being able to recover better during their sprint training sessions, replenish that ATP store for another bout of high intensity. But there's no real way of describing it, but just sprinting is like having a 5-litre fuel tank in a drag car, where it's like this engine uses like 5 litres or 10 litres or 15 litres of fuel, or 20 litres, however many litres of fuel in 5 seconds. But you've got, so in theory, if that engine had a supply of 20, if that engine had a supply of 100 litres, then it could go 10 times as far. But in the human body, unfortunately, we can't just strap a bigger fuel tank in. There are limitations. So it's that kind of theory. It's that the method of which fuel is delivered to the body is only good enough for such a short bout. But that's what zone 6 is to him. Now getting into the use of zone 2, the general idea is finding zone 2 is, or at least from previous videos, is, and they mention it in this one, the fact that previously they had stated that it's easier to find. You you just go exercise and you should be able to have this like it's kind of conversational. Maybe there's a pause in your breath, like you're not going to be delivering a conversation how I'm delivering one now, but it's for the most part not that taxing to have the conversation. But it almost best serves people who are currently essentially just doing HIIT every day, which is what I was getting the idea, and is what it's what Olav kind of alludes to in his video. But if you go into the GCN comment section, I'm going to pull one because I think I just won't mention the name of the person because I don't think it's relevant. But there's a comment that is, I used to do 30 minutes of HIIT every day. My thinking was, yeah, it's only 30 minutes, but I felt so tired every day. Then I discovered Zone 2 training and changed my routine to 1 hour or more Zone 2 riding every day and just do HIIT 1 time a week. Now I feel good with a lot of energy and got stronger on the bicycle. It was a video that I saw with Peter Etienne and Dr. Indigos, and that changed everything. This video is very informative in overtraining. And really, that's the thing. I think that's the best purpose. And it's why I think if you're performance driven, this can send you down the wrong path to some extent. Especially if you just listen to, for example, this one, and you don't really sit there and think as you're listening to this. Whereas if you're someone who's of the sort of, I want to just get healthier crowd, then this is almost perfect in the sense that maybe you're getting told by a PT that you need to do like high intensity, like all the time. That's all don't worry about like endurance stuff. The biggest bang for your buck is this Zone 2, this high intensity stuff. That's where this really serves a good purpose of showing people that like this low intensity stuff is pretty important. But in isolation, of course, as we mentioned already, it's not the one solution to solve it all. But that's where I'm going to say, correct me if I'm wrong. But all of this really portrays in a way that makes it seem like Iñigo is all about Zone 2 and nothing else in a way. It's like the questions are Zone 2 centric. So he's answering in a Zone 2 centric fashion. This, I think, comes from two areas. The new wave of people where Zone 2 is the new hit, whether that's a result of the Huberman crowd from Huberman Lab and the likes of like Pierre Etienne on the Drive, for example, who are incredibly focused on longevity and not performance. Although, for example, Etienne was at one point performance driven, but is pivoted in life as we mostly do when we get older. Zone 2, it's important for metabolic health. But if you're training for performance, that's not what you're looking for. It's great that it's a product of hunting for performance, in the sense that you will become incredibly metabolically healthy as a result of training 10 to 20 hours a week, if done right, and with an adequate amount of both high intensity and low intensity. But going, you know what, I'm just going to add some more volume and I'm just going to do Zone 2. That's not what it's trying to portray. And I think he makes also an invaluable statement on, ask yourself, what area of bioenergetics are you trying to stimulate? Now this statement, and I'm going to say two of these bits together, because obviously from this point, it's like, he just thinks that all you have to do is Zone 2. But man, it's on UAE, well educated. You'd be like, surely you can't think that it's just Zone 2. How are these guys so fast? But that's in this episode, but more importantly, in another GCN episode, titled Tadej Pogačar's Tour de France Training Secrets, His Coach Reveals All, ! Key piece, the exclamation mark. He highlights two bits of information. He highlights the fact that Zone 2 and Zone 4, so lactate threshold, make up the pillars of Tadej's training, because Zone 4 is how you win races. Yes, it's a bit different for people on like domestic level races and not world Grand Tours, where a Grand Tour you really are winning by threshold, because you're basically sitting at close to it, and then he attacks for a very brief period at over threshold, and then it's like you're in that threshold. So you do the gap, and then you just sit at a pace that no one can either match or close the gap and catch back onto you. Whereas we don't have, like, especially in the UK, how often do you turn up to a road race and there's a 1 hour climb? Never. I think in Wales, maybe, especially at race pace, you're probably talking 20-minute climbs at the upper end, I would have thought, but not sure. But we don't have mountains like the Tourmalet or something. So he highlights that. So then I'm all of a sudden like, oh man, this guy knows what he's doing. Of course he does. And there's no way Tadej Pogačar is just doing Zone 2, is there? So highlights that. So, do both. And then also, which is sort of in line with Olav in a sense of, this is another little gem. He states that, what area of bioenergetics are you trying to stimulate today? So when you go out, and you're going out for 4 hours, and you end up going out for 4 hours with a group, and then there's like attacks, and then you're covering stuff, and then all this stuff's going on, it's like, what are you trying to stimulate here from this 4-hour ride? If it is a race simulation, fair enough. But in most cases, you're probably just out there to tap it out for 4 hours. So, focus on stimulating that part of bioenergetics. So you ride at a Zone 2 and chill out, basically. Or endurance, shall we say. And then when you go do your threshold sessions, you don't want to be so cooked that you're actually doing tempo. You want to be stimulating the part of bioenergetics, which is maximizing glucose uptake, maximizing how much lactate you're using, which means you need to be at the top end / you need to be in that sort of threshold band, wherever that may be. And so train on your own, really, is what he says. It's like, train on your own. Having people to train with is great. Don't get me wrong. And I think it can be done well. You just almost need to vet the people you're training with. Or be in an environment where, people might attack, but it's like the group just comes back together. It's just like a little fun little thing or whatever. Versus you are on your rivet, or you're just so much stronger than those people that even if they do attack and they're being serious and you have to reel them back in, it's like you're at max, like, touching tempo, which versus you're doing an anaerobic attack and then sitting at threshold, and then it's like, by the time you come to threshold, you're so physically and most of the time psychologically burnt out that you don't want to. Really, a group ride, you should actually come back, in my opinion. Yeah, maybe when you first get off the bike, you're a little stiff, you're a little tired because it's like 4 or 5 hours on the pedals. But you should come back and be like, man, that was great. When we go now again? It was great to catch up with so-and-so. It was great to do this, great to do that. We saw all these different things. We rode easy. Happy days. And I think that's really what it needs to be. But, yeah. So, little gems of those. Obviously, Zone 2, Zone 4. Think what you're trying to achieve for this day. What is the purpose of this session? And go on from there. So, the biggest interesting note, and this is where I think they really do differ, is that he really does stick to the true, almost mathematical Zone 2 thought, where, like, say, for example, I don't know the exact percentage, but let's say 75%, as he puts, because he mentions it's not going to be an easy ride. Like, this is a hard ride. And so rather spend 4 hours at Zone 2 rather than 7 hours, where probably you're at zone 1, for example. I mean, you can see it if you look at the Stravas of riders like Brandon McNulty. Don't know whether he's coached by him directly or it's just a Team UAE philosophy, or whether he was and liked it, so he stuck with it, who seems to generally have a lower volume compared to other pros, like in the 20-hour region. They're ridden hard. Like, you look at the power output, and they're not easy rides. And Iñigo himself states he likes 23 to 20 hours a week as a sort of range for athletes, which as a result means, these are lower volume weeks comparatively, but they are spent in this, let's just call it a high quality zone. Like, it's very strict. I mean, when I look at it, I don't do this, because if I look at my known threshold of being like, I don't know, let's just say 330-ish watts, like in that region. Could I do it for an hour? No. Could I do it for 40 minutes? Yeah, probably. I've seen normalized powers of higher than that for an hour, and I've seen normalized powers of about 300 for 2.5 hours. So yeah, 40 minutes, probably possible. But if we took 330 as an FTP, especially if you got it from a ramp test. I mean, let's just say I did a ramp test. A ramp test, I could be like 345. Then you times that by 0.75 for 75%, 258 watts. And then if I just use my more reasonable number of 230, it's 247 watts, which is bloody hard work. And even if I go down to 70%, like 230 watts, that's a big number. I mean, he quotes like it could be anywhere from 250 to 300-ish. And imagine if you've got an FTP of 400 watts. Like, you did a 20-minute test at 420 or something, and then you got a 400 watt FTP, and then you go, I'm going to sit at 0.7. 280 watts. The physiological toll, I feel like that. Clearly, this method works because UAE are successful. But I think where in the general public this kind of slips up is, I think it works with elites because for that very reason, one, physiological specimens, but two, you've got this recovery time which you can actually manage this fatigue. Whereas I think the actual strain of doing these sort of efforts, both psychologically and physiologically, is really hard. Like, I think it takes a certain kind of individual to really thrive on this sort of work. And if that's the case, that's what you're doing, and you've got a job, I think if say somehow you're able to do 15 hours a week or 20 and you have a full-time job, that's already pretty taxing. If you do 15 hours a week and like 13 hours of it are at this sort of intensity, I think you'd cook yourself. I may be wrong. Feel free to like email me or go onto the Discord server and show your training and say, look, this works for me. This is how I managed it with a job. But I think it's, for non-elites or full-time people, this could cook yourself pretty easily. Now, I think if you're like that elite, but still somehow time restricted, like say you have a lot of other commitments, I don't know what, like say you've got a child or you've got a side business because you're full time but you still need to supplement your income, and you are, even though for an elite you're time crunched, like say you're an elite and you've got like really your biggest volume week is like 17 hours, then maybe your life stress is low enough and manageable enough where you can move things around in your day. Like, you don't have to get up at 6 to go to work to come back at 6. Like say you've got an 8 till 5 with a commute. I think it's probably too much stress, and probably where people burn out from zone 2, which again is just an example of why looking at the pros is a bit like looking at a study. It's Tadej Pogačar won the Tour and he was doing a lot of zone 2. I don't know what he was doing, but let's say he was doing a lot of zone 2 and then a good amount of zone 4, and you try to copy him and you cook yourself, it's like, yeah, because 1, you're not full-time, and 2, you're not Tadej Pogačar. Almost what you want to do is find like a domestic or like Conti pro who hasn't been riding since he was like 4 years old, has come from another sport that's maybe not endurance focused, and is still elite. Hasn't won the Tour, the Giro, or even ridden the Giro, but he's still better than 99% of cyclists in the world, and everything's not in his favour. So maybe have a look at what that person's doing, and that might educate you a bit more than looking at what the creme de la creme are doing. Yeah. So that's it for today's episode. Bit of a ramble, longer than a lot of other episodes, even though I didn't really plan much for this. I just went through the videos. Quite liked it, to be honest. I didn't enjoy that much going through the videos because I'd seen them all before, so going through them again wasn't that great. But delivering it, I quite enjoyed this little delivery, and I hope you enjoyed the delivery too. If you made it this far, you've got to like the podcast, surely, if you've got this far. So why not share it with a friend? Best way for this podcast to grow and reach more people. Like and rate the show. And make sure you follow it, so when future episodes come out, you'll be the first to hear about it. For any coaching inquiries, email the vo2lounge@gmail.com. If you'd like to be part of a Discord server where essentially just like-minded people are going to congregate, and hopefully we'll grow it into something really positive, then the Discord server link is down below. The sources, particularly just the 2 episodes I've mentioned in this episode, will be down below. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes, or consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics to the vo2lounge@gmail.com or the Discord server down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it is goodbye.